welcome to the Iowa Files. Just want to make sure everybody is entered into the drawing for a copy of the amazing photography book that Mr. Anderson has kindly donated. So there are strips of paper in the back, and you can throw your name into the hat, and we'll choose it after Mr. Anderson's drawing. So I'm Gail Brubaker. I'm the Executive Director of the West Des Moines Historical Society. Thank you and the West Des Moines Library, EMC Insurance, and the State of Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, and our members and donors who help make free programs such as this possible. So, barns. How many of you have a favorite barn when you were growing up or have wonderful memories? They symbolize the agricultural heritage of those who founded this state. As barns are abandoned and destroyed, we are losing an important tie to our past. The Iowa Barn Foundation board member, Ober Anderson, has spent much of his professional life studying and documenting Iowa barns. And as a retired staff member of the Iowa State University Extension Service, he chaired the ag exhibits in the new museum for many years when they first opened the new barn museum. This man is a font of absolutely amazing pictures and memories and stories. So thank you, Ober Anderson.
Okay, she's already stole a little of my thunder, but how many, as that includes everybody, has played in a barn when you were a kid? Well, look at those hands up. Because if you had a cousin, a city cousin, they love to go play in the barn. And so that's why, one reason why barns are so important. But anyway, I have appreciated growing up with barns. And of course, in my career as extension, I worked with farmers. And then I also did over 500 farm appraisals my second career. So I was probably in about 2,000 barns just studying the value of those buildings. So that's where we're at anyway. The American barn is what we're here about today. And how many, we've already asked that question. Several years ago, the Des Moines Register had an article saying that 70% of the people had been born on the farm. And I'm sure that number is going down rapidly. But for over 300 years, till our country was settled, until 1950, the barn was the central building for most barns. However, after World War II, I'll show you a couple of slides later, this changed drastically. So anyway, we're all interested in barns. At one time, we were second only to Kansas. We had over 200,000 barns. Estimates now is probably 35,000. And we were moving along pretty good, and then the derecho hit. We had 2 different 100-mile-an-hour winds, and those old barns didn't do so well. So that's why we called them those cathedrals of the prairie, as an important part of our history. This fine old barn was taken out by a tornado just a few years ago, shortly after they'd restored it. Our foundation was organized in 1997, dedicated to preserving barns, and so we've saved approximately 250 old barns, and we usually have what we call is a 50% grant. And we have a limit on our grants too, but we'll be meeting now next week to assign some grants. The board meets twice a year. People fill out applications to do that. Just a little bit of history. We were fortunate that in the very early years, a Texas Foundation gave us $50,000 to kind of get us started and kicked off. But not all barns can be saved. You'll see that barn a little bit later. They had to burn it because it simply was way beyond repairs. And that barn's got some character, though. But family-sized farms were small. We had beef, dairy, sheep, cattle, horses, and even chickens all in the one building. Families were self-sufficient. Farms were 80 to 160 acres in size. After World War II, though, we started to feed the world. And farms became more mechanized and larger. They had specialized buildings then at that time. The barn, as you know it, is a thing of the past, and very few barns were ever constructed after 1960. Even those old pioneer barns, there's a barn back there, it probably housed a horse and a team of oxen. That was about it. But I can imagine the children probably played in the barn at that time too. Then in the early days, about the time my maternal great-grandparents moved to central Iowa, there were even a few sod houses up in northern Polk County and Story County where my great-grandparents moved into. And they were out from Des Moines on west. We're in what they call the tall prairie grass area. There's not a lot of trees. So even from the time of way back in Thomas Jefferson, barns have been a very important part of it. Each area had their own special barns depending where the settlers came from. In the east, we have some big Dutch barns in New York State, some other ones. But basically, from the west Mississippi River west, we have what they call a prairie barn because it had a lot of hay storage. This is one of my favorite barns. It's right up here on Highway 210 in Polk County. I guess that'd be Story County. Yeah? But the wagon train, 1855, came into town. My maternal grandparents were on that. And interesting enough, they built their house in 1865, and 1855, and the new house was constructed in 1865. So they built the house ahead of the barn. I've been on a couple of farms where people lived in a temporary chicken house because their house didn't make any money for the family, but they built a barn first in temporary housing, and then they could afford to build a house. But that house, interesting enough, up here, it's just been recently sold to a lady that's going to have a wedding venue in it. She's going to convert that into a wedding venue now. There's the new barn, and they will have all kinds of whatever they do at wedding areas. Yeah, but there's that wagon train I spoke to you about. They came from west of Chicago out to central Iowa in 1855, 10 years before the railroad was in Des Moines. My great-grandmother was 4 years old, and her husband-to-be was 14. She passed away when I was 2 years old. So theoretically, she could, I'm sure, bounce me on her knee up at Cambridge where my grandmother lived. To think of how young central Iowa was compared to eastern Iowa that was along the river. There weren't a lot of rivers running east-west. They were mainly north-south. So you only got to Des Moines in central Iowa either on foot, horse, or oxen. Tall grass prairies. 3/4 of our landscape was covered by tall grass prairie before the settlers came along. Oftentimes it was 8 to 10 feet tall. Parents worried about losing children or grass fires. And I heard the story once, I read an article, even the Iowa Highway Commission hired some guys to take a plow and get a plow from Des Moines to the western part of our country because people kept getting lost when they're going west in the wagon trains. And so they actually had to plowed it. Up at Huxley, where they moved in, those Norwegians, anyone know where Ballard Country Club is? It's a golf course, Ballard Country Club. Well, early days, that was the timber farms. If you bought a farm in northern Polk County or Story County, didn't have timber, you had to have that to burn, you had to have it for buildings. So they sold timber lots, anywhere from 2 to 25 acres, in what is now Ballard Country Club. There's a German bank barn, here's an old Norwegian barn, and I would imagine that's going to stand forever and ever. So barns are agricultural heritage, as I mentioned, and they're also values of hard work, honesty, integrity, and family. Because family is just like a family-owned business. The family worked together and lived together. And that made for quite a family operation. Lifting hay in a barn. Today, the Amish still are involved in barn building. And if you've been any place in areas where the Amish are settled, you'll see these guys help each other building barns. And when people call me to want repair old barns, I often refer them to the Amish because they do an excellent job. I've known Amish to travel as much as Eileen, your sister, had them travel to Hardin County when she had the work done paid by the insurance company. And they would get into I guess what I'm trying to say, a van and come up daily, I think, to do that work. Yeah, the driver. But they're excellent farmers. I mentioned World War II. This is pretty critical. But look at World War II. We were hardly feeding ourselves and a few others. Well, what happened in World War II? We started feeding the world. And now the number there is up in the hundreds. But the truth is, with our large farm operations, it's beyond that. It's in the thousands. And some people call it factory farms and commercial farms. But if it's operated by a family and their own children, it's a family farm, unless you've got lots of hired help. Not surprisingly, look where horsepower on tractors pass horsepower on horses. But believe it or not, World War II. And they figured it's on there something, one tractor could do the work of 5 horses or something like that, But I can remember as a young boy, we used horses for hauling the manure or for running the spring when we seeded oat seeding. So it didn't do it. We were turning over to tractors at that time. And anybody ever candle eggs or gather eggs? I'm going to ask you that. I had a lady one time in a group that said, yes, after school, that was her job. She went up to the grocery store to candle eggs. Every grocery store had to have an egg candler because that's the way mom didn't have any money for her groceries. She took 15 dozen, whoopsie, she took 15 dozen eggs at a time in, and then the guy, my grocer, would write down she'd had a plus or a minus. At the end of the month, she gave him cash, but rarely did she give him each time. There's the old family farm. That's a poor Norwegian farm up in my home farm. Because I say, believe it or not, I'm the middle child of 11. And I milked cows by lantern light until when I was 9 years old. Then my dad bought a farm because prior to that, World War II, he could not get electricity unless you owned the farm. So we had electrical poles put in, and believe it or not, they were constructed by prisoners of war from Algona in the prison camp over there. And I think my mom probably gave them coffee and crinkle during the breaks even. But again, that old barn, which is not a fancy one, we had milk cows over here. We had a couple of horses and sheep and hogs, and this wing over here had a few cattle. We had everything. We did have a separate building though for the chicken house. Then, as I say, all of a sudden, after World War II, we've had hog confinement buildings have gone up, and even though none of us in this room want to live next to one, I'm telling you, with the price of beef going up, and it's going to go higher, guys, our beef cow herds are the lowest in 62 years because of the drought out in west. So if you can find a special on beef, you better buy it right now and put it in your freezer. But poultry and chicken are going to be much cheaper as they are now. And one reason they're cheaper is because you got these huge buildings. You can take your choice. Don't live next to one because there's some odors there you may not want. But if you want to go to the grocery store, we have enough troubles lately without having to close these down. And believe it or not, California won't buy our hogs anymore unless the sows were in open space. They don't want them confined to a stall where you keep the baby pigs alive, by the way. And they know nothing about agriculture. Same way with poultry. Unless you have an open flock, if you're in caged layers, they won't buy our eggs. We're the largest egg producer in the United States, and California is one of our markets. The California grocers and other people are already trying to get them to change that rule. There's my sister's operation. She and her husband up in the Winnebago County. Early 1960s, one of the very first poultry operations. I think they had about 7,000 to 10,000 chickens in that house right there. Of course, there's their old barn back there. But they were one of the first confinement houses that I know of. Barn basketball. I went to 8 years of country school, we didn't even have a basketball hoop. So naturally, when we got into high school, the kids in the city, in little towns, had played basketball since they could walk. My brother wanted to play basketball, so he would get a hay knife and he'd chop the hay, feed it out. When he got to the ground floor, he could shoot baskets. Well, then as he got down to the free throw line, and if the whole barn was sold out, he could probably shoot a three-pointer. But anyway, barn basketball, especially girls 6-on-6. Anyone ever watched that when you were younger? A lot of those are small towns. Cities didn't have, Des Moines did not have any girls basketball. So many a gal on a cold winter morning honed her skills in a drafty old coal barn. There's our barn foundation. I'm at a Historical Society building in Ankeny. I decided to join them when I saw this barn building decided to build up. So I've been a member since that time. And I was told that the school superintendent and the chairman of our Historical Society remembered playing in a barn when they were kids, and they wanted a barn. So the rest is history. We had a barn dance. I was involved in getting that set up before we opened up in 2006. What would that be? 17 years ago. Just as old barns had barn dances when they got started. And there's a museum. We still have some 7th and 8th grade classes that visit, and I used to be involved in taking them through the ag exhibits, but haven't in recent years. Interesting enough, we had a display on the Des Moines munitions plant, and these two women both worked in the munitions plant. One of them is deceased, but one of them is still alive, and they actually worked as young women in the Des Moines ordnance plant, south of Ankeny. I understand the Johnson Historical Society has a barn. I haven't personally visited that, but they moved it into town and used it for that reason.
We have
you excuse me, I've been talking too much. Take a break.
That Johnston barn,
Yeah.
my granddaughters had their graduation party there, and they have wedding venues. It's
Oh, yeah.
beautiful inside.
Okay, here's another old barn up north of Ankeny. Unfortunately, that's now been destroyed. They built a bunch of houses there. Another barn not too far from us, really, the Whittern barn on Army Post Road. And that's a very, has a lot of history behind it. They had shorthorn cattle they showed at the Chicago Livestock Exposition. And that one, it's 1,200 acre farm. And Whitterns own it. I think the family still owns it. The ones that have that, what is it? Whittern also developed the coin-operated cigarette machines and all the machines that they do that for. So it's an old Army Post Road. And there's another old barn up on the, I call it Polk City Road, northeast of Ankeny. I happen to know that those guys came and lived in a covered wagon, two brothers, the first winter while they built their house and barn and then brought their family. They also bought some White Park cattle. They were brought from Britain into Canada because they didn't want to lose them during the history of the White Park cattle, which were they ran in wild almost in game preserves. They took them to Canada. Then Canada didn't want them anymore. They sent them down to the King Ranch in Texas. They decided they were tired of them. So this farmer up at Polk City bought all those White Park cattle. And you'll still see them if you go take the road north of Ankeny and drive east or west. You'll see those White Park cattle on the north side of the road. They have 40 acres that never seen a plow. I understand the Drake Botany Department takes students out there because of the prairie that's there. Of course, one reason it's a prairie is it's below the county tile, so you'd have to have a lift pump to drain it. Another old barn called the Geisler Barn. Some of you might have seen that in the news recently. The Polk County Zoning Commission voted against this conservative Christian organization setting up a retreat. I wrote a letter in defense of the barn saying, I arranged 35 years ago for an ag engineer from Iowa State to visit that barn to discuss putting hog confinement, or not hog farrowing halls in it. He said it was too expensive to do that, but he said it's a lot cheaper just to tear it down, build a hog confinement setup, which they could have done. The Polk County Board of Supervisors has nothing to do with building hog confinements, except in the real high intense areas. I said, would you rather have a hog confinement building or a Christian retreat in your community? The board of supervisors overvoted the zoning commission. I don't know that my letter had anything to do with it, but another old barn built in 1898. There's a fine barn built in 1910, east of I-35 as you go north of Ankeny. I know this farmer very well. I had him host some Russian visitors for me once. But his grandfather had sales there, and they would sell draft horses, and they would actually had a ring around that barn, and they would have the horses work out during the sale. And there's a fine barn. A friend of mine moved it not too far from us over here, again, Old Army Post Road down in Jordan. And he had that wooden peg barn moved down there, and he also has a log cabin that he moved from northern Minnesota on his farmstead. We've had several Iowa State University alumni foundation gatherings there. Again, a couple of other barns, the Harley-Davidson barn, which you'll see from the interstate, or there's a bridal shop at Kids, Iowa, where our granddaughter bought her wedding dress, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, Eileen? Anyway, barns are used now.
The Harley-Davidson?
Yeah, the Harley-Davidson right here, you'll see it from I-35.
Oh, I know, but is that new construction? Or
Oh yeah, it's new, but it's a mimicking. But my point is they're selling our barns, see. Another one, same thing, is a farm management facility right across the street. You'll see that one too. So we'll do anything to keep barns going. Levy History Farms, of course, has a couple of real nice barns. They got the old style one, and then they got the prison farm. At one time, the prison farm, I think you have another picture, it's on the National Registry. At one time, they had 40 mules in the lower level. And not too long, I think about the time I graduated from Iowa State, the prison farm was then being sold, and they made it, Living History Farms then, of course, purchased it. But that fine old barn, they used to back hay wagons up there to unload the hay, and again, horses and mules in the lower level. The other one, this is a typical Western barn, that old style barn like my home farm. And again, it had a lot of hay storage, and you would have horses and cattle on the lower level. Another old barn. I don't know if this is still standing at the State Fair or not. It was rebuilt in 1994 and used to display baby farm animals until I think a real estate guy, he and his wife built a fine new facility for that display. Now this is one that I had about 25 magazines when I came in, so you folks should have one of those in your hands. In 2011 or 12, I wrote an article on this barn. It was really interesting. There's the old barn, as it was a dairy barn located in the Valley, west of Moines School grounds. And I don't know how many of you know, but Valley has the smallest footprint of any school of its size in the state. In other words, space is sacred to them. They just don't have a lot of space. And so they wanted to sell that barn. They put an ad in the paper. The only thing is you had to restore the ground level if you got the barn. Well, unfortunately, they didn't get any bids on that barn. Who would want to move a barn, you know? Well, when the public found out about it, I say this lovingly, the soccer moms, because Facebook was just starting to get popular about that time, they created so much stink and stir. They were sending kids together, bringing toddlers to school with signs saying, "Save the barn." I even gave $5, bought a t-shirt that said, "Save the barn" from them. And they sent me down to the city council meeting. I went to the city council meeting. I hope I'm not stepping on any feet here. But see, the school board and city council did not get along very well on that issue. The school board says, "We will move the barn if you will, or no, we'll keep the barn if you'll forgive us from the water quality pool that we have to have with our construction." Well, of course, that's federal law. The city council had no ability to do that. So they even accused them of blackmail, trying to do one for the other. Well, anyway, there's another barn just like that Barnes barn. Now this barn's all loaded up, ready to move, but notice they did not move the bottom lower level. And with today's technology, those old brick barns, you couldn't move them 20, 30 years ago, but 10, 12 years ago, you could. They were computerized. They had about 15 different hoists. They could gradually move them up. And I saw the bill for moving that barn, which a church down here, probably only about within 5 miles of where we're sitting, bought that. They used it for storage, I'm told. I think the bill was, if I'm not correct, was at least $18,000 to $25,000 to move the electrical lines. And I'm sure the school board members who wanted to be reelected voted in favor of that. Because it was that kind. But again, the joke of it is, I could show you hundreds of barns, probably more justifiable to save. But for some reason, the timing was such, and they got this done, so you have your Valley West of Moines barn. Maybe I've told you more than you want to know about it. But anyway, there are a lot of different kinds of barns. We have grants, as they say, 50% cost sharing. And just some real quick examples now of barns. There's an old barn, can be preserved, but it happens, there's been restored, quite a change. They'll last a long time. This barn has character, but I don't think it's going to be restored. I think it's probably some western state. That's another one. You see, we don't have mountains in Iowa, but that's still barn. That barn has character. Now this barn up at near Iowa Falls, built in 1918, obviously had a glorious time. But look at all the windows. Could you imagine if you lived on this acreage? How would you like to paint and rescrape the barns and fix those windows? They had no choice. They had no choice but to burn it. And they had 48 windows, 12 cow stanchions. They had horses' names back in those times. The horses all had names, you know, and Babe, Bird, Maine, and Dick, and so on. We're all part of that. Now, again, some quick before and after pictures. Notice the improvement. A lot of these folks have done the expense on themselves. And I think you know that these barns are not, they're functionally obsolete. They have no value, or very limited value. But because of that tremendous change since 1950 on, they aren't building any new ones much beyond 1960. Again, quite a change. Another barn. A lot of changes have taken place in some of these barns. Now, round barns, they're quite popular. I understand there's even a religion called the Shaker religion that's involved with some of the barns. I'm not saying that all the barns were religious constitute, but they had something to do. They came over from England or Europe anyway, and some of the people, there's even a Shaker cemetery in southern Iowa that I ran across. Again, before and after. They're still working on that one. Another Hamilton County. I was showing these at a care center down here in Des Moines, and one guy says, "Oh, that's my Uncle Benny's farm." So, you know, he remembered it right away. Now, this one's up at Nevada. I knew that family very well, the Hansecker family, and up in the town of Fernald. And it's built of limestone, the basement. And, of course, limestone erodes when it comes in contact with water and a lot of that. So they had to go to a lot of work to restore that barn. This farm has a lot of history, too, because it's just like the Hubble barn, the Rosenfeld family, when I worked for Extension, the member of the family, Louise Rosenfeld, was the head home economist of Iowa. She was in charge of Iowa State University Extension home economist. Anyway, they had showed livestock at the Chicago Livestock Exposition. The 1925 champion came through that barn. That's near Kelly, south of Ames. One of the early barns in Iowa was built in 1860 outside of Decorah. I'm sure that was one of those Norwegian barns. Hog barn, large barn near the smaller one outside Decorah. And this is one of my favorite barns. It's favorite because this man, Norman Borlaug, probably saved more lives than any man that ever lived in the world. He developed the wheat and the rice that were disease-free, and that's his home farm in Cresco. He was graduated from high school during the Depression, had no money to go to college, but he had a wrestling scholarship. They offered him one at Minnesota. He went to Minnesota for his undergraduate, and that's what got him through. But like I say, he developed a lot of ideas. He got his BS, his embassy degrees from Minnesota, and then he got his doctorate degree down Texas A&M. But I read a couple of his books. He pioneered some of the wheat research, and in Pakistan, the government would not approve his biotech seed. But some of the farmers purposely planted wheat up in the uplands. And they took some of the leading government officials up to that wheat field that was a distance away from the capital and said, "You've got two choices. You can let your people starve and have uprisings, or you can improve this wheat." Again, they improved the wheat for him. And he just passed away, well, 15 years ago at age 95. I don't know if you remember or not, at the Iowa Historical Building, they had a sculpture. I happened to go out there, and I have a picture of the sculptor developing Norman Borlaug's sculpture, which has now been moved to the Washington, D.C. Okay, why are most barns painted red? I did a little research on that for an article I wrote, and some say it was so the cows could find their way home, but that's not the right answer. And it was actually a wood preservative, and they found out that a mixture of linseed oil and some rust even extended it. So for some reason, red is still one of the winning choices here. And the guys down our Historical Society board is also a semi-professional photographer. He does an excellent job. He's been taking pictures in these round barns the last few years that are in our magazine. There's almost a work of art. Look at you could lay back in the hay there and some lemonade in your hand and probably look at that roof for quite a while and enjoy that. So the well-recognized American symbol, the American barn, and according to my biased appraisal, the American flag, I mean, the barn is second only to the American flag. There's probably people recognizing it, knowing what it is. The book I had, I think we're going to give one away here shortly. I passed one around for your information. And again, that would make a fine coffee table book for home or office. I'm biased because I wrote the introduction to it. And anyway, we used it as a fundraiser. We're selling those now at $24. That includes the mailing fee. I can sell them for $20 if I hand carry it, which I have here, several of them available today. We do have a summer barn tour scheduled for Van Buren County. We normally cover a certain region of the state, But this year we're cooperating with a organization in Van Buren County who already have identified a lot of barns for us on the tour. And so for 2 days you can have free lunches available at one of them. And if you've never been to what we call the villages of Van Buren County, that's worth that for a trip alone. If you're an antique buff, you can go there. My son-in-law and daughter own a farm in Van Buren County. Whenever they go down there, my wife gets an order. She goes to the Amish store and she gets, what do you say, 50% or more on some of the spices. You know, they buy it in bulk. You can buy spices and coffee and you name it at the, what's the name of that store? Yeah. The Dutchman store. Yeah. And they're just expanding. They're huge. Okay. The 2023 Iowa State Fair booth will be at the Ag Building this year. We've been up in Pioneer Hall for about 20 years, and I've helped out from time to time. But this year, we were able to get us into the Ag Building. So when you go to look at the butter cow, stop by our booth. And I told you that our Iowa Barn magazine, which I had copies available today, it comes out twice a year, and anybody who contributes $50 is kind of an annual membership. It used to be $25, but printing costs have gone up like everything else. So now anybody that gives us $50 a year will get a free subscription to that. So things have changed. There's the old farm 2-row planter that my dad had when I was a kid, pulled by two horses. And you see that thing right there? That's a row marker that tells where the horse is supposed to go when he turns around. Now there's a 48-row planter. How tall of those would the row marker have to be to find him where he should go back to the field? Well, you don't have to worry about that. He uses a satellite. Yeah, farmers right now. I understand now they even have a 56-row planter. And this is 40-inch rows. These are 20-inch rows. You know why that's a 40-inch row? That's the rear end of a horse. And the horse has to go between the two rows so you don't knock down the corn. So we planted corn at 40, then lowered it to 38. Now a lot of it's being planted at 20-inch rows. So we're down now to questions, and have any questions at all? I'll try to answer that. And I've got my son and my wife along because of my hearing, if they have to repeat a question for me. Who's got a question? Yes.
Could you explain a little bit more about candling?
Candling? Oh yes, well, you know, all you needed was about a light bulb in a box, and you put something over your head, and you hold that light bulb up there, and you'd look, see if it rotten egg or if it had a baby chick in it. And of course, if you don't gather the egg, well, what happened too is chickens, you know, have a way of escaping, and they'll lay eggs someplace. And what do they do when they get 3 or 4 eggs? They start sitting on them. That's what we call a cluck hen. It stops laying. It wants to raise those chickens. And so that's another reason for candling. If a farmer or his wife had gathered some eggs from up in the haymow, you know, that didn't get gathered, they didn't want to pay for rotten eggs. And, yeah. Another question in the back.
So what was the purpose, or why did people build round barns?
I guess I could say novelty. Religious purpose was a small percentage of it. Yeah. And they probably were pretty efficient, though. There weren't any corners, you know. And sometimes they put a silo in the middle of it, too, which made it easy to feed the cattle. Yeah. But they're expensive to repair. That's one thing, too. And I didn't mention that, but believe it or not, Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward sold barns. You could buy a kit. He's nodding his head. You could buy a kit, and I suppose it had instructions and told you how to put it together. Yeah. Other questions? Again.
For the barns that can't be saved, instead of burning them, is there someone who can salvage that wood?
Yes, there is, and we have a small demand for old barn boards. Yeah. I know my sister-in-law 50 years ago, she remodeled their basement, put barn boards to the side because of a little character. But you know what happens? If I own that barn, you've got to take it all or none. Yeah. I don't want you to mess up my barn. or else I'll take some of the boards off safely and I'll sell them to you. Yeah. But seriously, again, the work that's involved. Yeah. But you're right, some of the barns. Question?
Oh, for the most part, what kind of wood were these made from? I mean, what was the building wood?
What was the wood?
In Iowa?
What kind of wood was used?
Wood, a lot of it was probably pine. I visited a barn in eastern Iowa that my son-in-law's family was involved with, and we couldn't figure out it was cypress. It came down the Mississippi River from Wisconsin because it was insect-free. And believe it or not, they put white pine pegs in that barn. The cypress boards were fine, but the pegs were rotting out. So, and redwood, of course, it went at high price now, but there were a variety of, but probably a lot of ash and pine were used, yeah. Okay, other questions?
I have a question. Do you see like people turning barns into houses a lot? I mean,
Again, there's some of it. I should have had a picture of those. I've probably seen 8 or 10 where they've converted them into housing. And I saw one where they even had converted a round steel grain bin into housing. I think south of Ames, you'll see one of those on Highway 69. But again, you have to be interested in that. The cost is probably pretty high, but yet there's some nostalgia there too. So, and on the other hand, in Europe and sometimes in the Northeast, they built the house attached to the barn. They did that so you didn't have to go out in the snow and cold to milk the cows in the morning. And so on the other hand, it would have some, when you're having the ladies' tea over, you say, what's that smell, you know? So by and large, we got away from just to separate the two. But I guess the thing, and again, most of you people know this, up until 1950, when the bulk of Iowa lived on the farm family, they worked together, they played together. You know, they had even before seed corn was developed, which is about the time I was born. They'd shell seed corn, air corn, to use for seed this year. And rather than do it by themselves, they sometimes invited a few neighbor ladies. They went over to help them too, and they would do that. So they had work sessions together. Other questions?
Well, I just wanted to comment about when my parents first started farming, when they would, in the fall, the grain they would have, they were still using like a threshing machine.
Oh, yes.
So, all the neighbors would come and the men would work, the women would get
Until
lunch ready and,
until I was 9 years old, we had a steam engine. And the steam engine and horse-drawn, and when I was 14, I remember one of my last threshing runs for my dad. I got to drive the tractor. That was a big deal, especially because you ever eat some of those meals they serve you? They're really good. You go outdoors. But even the one reason then people started, of course, because of labor. And another thing, why do you suppose everybody had oats for threshing?
Either horses.
Yeah, horses run on oats. Tractors run on diesel and gas. You can't give them oats. No. And also, it was part of the conservation 4-year plan. We went corn, oats, meadow, 4-year rotation. And soybeans didn't come in until I was in grade school or high school almost. My dad would, if he had a lot of rain in June and it drowned out a patch of corn, he would plant soybeans and millet, and then he would let that grow and he would cut it for hay. But soybeans came in, and then you'd see the soybean combines, and of course China buys half our soybeans, and ethanol gets over half of our corn too, by the way. So things have changed tremendously. Other questions?
Obviously, it depends on the extent of renovation work that have to be done, but what's kind of an average renovation cost? Go ahead.
Oh boy, we require 2 estimates to do it. And I would say it'd be pretty tough to see it under 10,000, and I've seen it as high as 60 to 80,000, even 100. Believe it or not, and the fact is, since I've been on the board about 5 years, we've given 2 grants of 25,000, which I personally was opposed to because they went to, believe it or not, historical societies. And I said, historical societies, they can get their own money. We give it to people who don't need it. And I think, unfortunately, we've had people, so the average 10 to 12, probably, and we'll go 50% of it, but we need 2 estimates of the cost of repairs. And I always say if the foundation is pretty solid, you haven't sagged anything, and if the roof supports, not necessarily the roof boards or the shingles are good support, then you could probably repair it at a cost. But there are fewer of them. There's fewer and fewer available every year. So if we don't save them this year, the next time another derecho comes along, we won't have to worry much about it. But I think it's nice. We've saved 250 in Iowa. That's 3 barns per county average, And a lot of people repaired them on their own. So we're going to have 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 barns around for a long time for people to look at them. Yeah. Any other questions?
If somebody else has one, go ahead. So if you were going to go ahead and do a renovation, do you require that you go back to like a shingle that was on there? Or
Good question. We used to require wood shingles, but of course you know what's happened to fire insurance of those. So we had to make that into asphalt or even metal. We've approved. But what they are kind of particular on, they like it to, if you're going to turn it into a lawn and garden center, we don't want to help pay you do that, see. But we'd like to restore it to its original purpose. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Some of these barns had an attached silo.
Say again.
Some of the barns had silos near them. We have one that was made out of brick.
Yep.
It came from either Redfield or Adel.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know very much about how they made the silage or what they
Yeah.
even made.
Well, again, most every farm eventually because silos were a cheap way of storage, especially if we had early frost in northern Iowa, which we could get. And if the corn wasn't mature, we could chop it and put it in the silo, and then we could use it for feeding silage. And I've helped Dad to throw some frozen silo when we got to use the pickaxe to get it off the walls and throw it down too. But it was good livestock feed. Because you remember, how many stomachs does a cow have? 5. Cows can eat roughage and silage. Pigs and horses require simple foods. Yeah. So really, silage and forage were an excellent way, a low-cost way, so most farms had one. Then we even built those fancy blue silos, you know, and boy, I think the guy that did the best on those was the salesman. But ideally, those were never intended for storage. They were just a vehicle where you were to refill them. Somebody chop oats early and maybe corn, but they were very expensive to build. But they did a good job. They're vacuum sealed, yeah. Other questions? If not, I thank you much. You've been a very attentive audience, and I brought my son and the wife along. My son was going to be my bouncer if you gave me any trouble, but it's his birthday tomorrow, so this is his birthday gift, was to come to my program today. Okay.
That's yours.
Yeah.
We need to pick a winner out of the hat. So, for the lovely book that you brought. Okay. It's your boy, you're just getting all the great gifts, aren't you?
Put my name in it.
That way, if somebody's disappointed,
That's true. Nobody's going to come mess with them. Go ahead and read it. Oh.
Marlin Doctor.
All right. So, thank you all so much for coming today. Next month, did you know that Muscatine, Iowa was known as the pearl button capital of the world? I see some of you nodding. Companies in Muscatine manufacture more than 1.5 billion, that's with a B, mother pearl buttons each year. So the Iowa State Button Society member, Karen Liebold, will share the history of buttons and more information about these little teeny tiny works of art. That's going to be on Sunday, April 18th, 2:30 here. I want to thank you all for coming today. We have 2 more Iowa File sessions, and then we take the summer off. So next I will be asking you for suggestions, what you want to see next time.
I have a few books in case anyone's interested.
Oh, yeah, those of you who didn't win a book can get one for the very low price of $20. Right. If you enjoyed this, please, I ask you, think about becoming a member of the West Des Moines Historical Society. It's your donations that help us offer these sort of free programs and all the education we do in the community. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next month.